I was offered places at the Fletcher School, at Harvard, and at Princeton, but I didn't have any money, and they needed $20,000 for the first year. So I couldn't go. And for the first time in my life, I realized, well, it's all very well to be good, but if you don't have money, there are barriers. I can look back now and say the best years of my life, my greatest achievements have all occurred since then. And so had I taken my life, I really would have missed out on a great deal.
Paul is the author of 11 books, from his path-breaking 2005 book on the rise of China, Thunder from the Silent Zone, Rethinking China, to his latest book of love poetry, The Three Graces, Companionship, Discretion, Passion, 2022. He's featured on both radio and television for many years as a respected commentator on international affairs. He's been a frequent and authoritative contributor to major print media for 25 years. He's spoken at all these various clubs on topics ranging from espionage and national security to the implications of the Chinese power, religion in a secular age, the nature of Western civilization, and educating young minds for the 21st century.
It's not a bad introduction.
Yeah, so within there's so many questions I'd have for you, particularly around how you got interested in various topics. Mm-hmm. China, for example. But let's start with how you grew up.
How I grew up, okay. So do you want me to just give you a riff on that, or do you have more specific questions about how I grew up?
Just whatever you want to say. It's the idea is it kind of helps people connect with where someone's ended up by going back to how it all began and kind of what influences there were in an early age.
Well, I guess the simplest account of how I grew up is I was one of 9 children in a rather old-fashioned conservative Catholic family. I grew up in the outer eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and my father was a small businessman, and I had a very quiet, very affectionate upbringing. And my mother in particular, from the youngest age, used to shower me with genuinely good reading material, magazines, children's magazines, of course, and children's books. And for whatever reason, because I was one of 9 and I was really the only one who did this, I became a precocious and passionate reader. And when I was still at primary school, I started reading adult books, history, political biography, and so forth. I suppose the only other thing I'd add in order to keep these opening remarks relatively brief is that there was a seminal influence on me in 5th grade when the 5th grade teacher, Kath Gill, chose to read us children's stories. She read us Wind in the Willows. She read us The Hobbit. She read about 4, I think, of the Narnia books. But above all, she read The Lord of the Rings. And for me, that was actually a transformative experience. Being transported inside Tolkien's imaginary world brought alive to me for the first time, really, what a whole world might actually look like in space and time, with its different cultures and each with their own poetries and histories, with simplified but global struggle between good and evil, with small people, the hobbits, playing an outsized role when the powerful and wise were barely able to cope with what was going on. It was quite an extraordinary influence. But whereas many people, I think, read The Lord of the Rings and then become hooked on fantasy, I never got interested in fantasy. I very quickly decided, what would it be like to get one's mind around the real world in the way that The Lord of the Rings describes an imaginary world? So I've never really been interested in other fantasy. I've still loved The Lord of the Rings, but I've spent most of my life trying to get my mind around our world in space and time in all its complexity.
Mm-hmm. What was the story about the presentation you did on Stalin in primary school? Was it Stalin or Mao?
No, that's a choice anecdote. There is one about Stalin, which I'll come back to. But no, what happened was the end of 6th grade is that the class teacher arranged for a breakup party about 3 or 4 weeks before school ended. And the idea was that each of us would would bring along something to contribute to a picnic. And my mother gave me $2, which is equivalent, of about $25 today. So it was a reasonable amount of money to get some cake or sandwiches or lolly water or whatever to take to the party. But I knew that if I went to the local news agency, which unlike news agencies now, which only have magazines, had racks of serious books, that I could get political biographies for $1 each. And I had $2. So I went straight to the news agency. I bought Stuart Strand's biography of Mao Zedong and Alexander Worth's biography of Charles de Gaulle. And I went to a different park. I didn't go to the party. And I sat all day reading the life of Mao Zedong. This was a Friday. And because I'd only had $2 and I spent it on books, I didn't even have any lunch. But I was totally absorbed in reading the life of Mao. And I got home at the end of the day and Mum said, "How was the day?" And I said it was terrific, which it had been. I didn't say anything about the party. And then Monday we're back at school and the class teacher says, "Why weren't you at the party?" And I said, "I was elsewhere reading the life of Mao Zedong." And I've always thought to this day that she must have immediately thought, that's the weirdest excuse for truancy I've ever heard. And thinking perhaps to catch me out, she said, "Well, your punishment is you're going to have to give a talk to the class about the Chinese Civil War." Now, this was my idea of what school should be like. And I was enthusiastic. So I said, "Have you got a map of East Asia?" And yes, she did. She rolled it out over the blackboard. "And have you got a pointer?" "Yes." So away I went. And I gave them a talk about the Chinese Civil War, the origins of it, the Long March, the communist victory. She said to my mother a week or so later, "He seemed to know what he was talking about." I didn't have the first idea. But after that, to come back to the thing about Stalin, I actually asked Mum, would she and Dad give me for my 12th birthday, which was, only a week or two later again, Isaac Deutsch's biography of Stalin. And they did. And I've still got that old book. I've got many books on Stalin now, but that was my first one. But I kept it because she'd written inside it, "Happy birthday to dear Paul, love from Mummy and Daddy," on a biography of Stalin, if you don't mind. I just love that.
And what was it about these Stalin and Mao and de Gaulle that you were interested in at that age?
Oh dear, pardon me, that was my phone burbling. I'll just switch it off. There we go. I suppose one answer to that question is that I was already interested in history. In third grade, my mother had given me a book called A Pageant of History, and it had stories about all the English monarchs, about Dante, about Hannibal, Caesar, the Bible, James Cook, all sorts of things. And I just ate that stuff up. So by the time we get to the end of sixth grade, that's 3 years on, and I'd been reading whatever history I can get my hands on, about ancient Greece, about Rome, whatever. I found my father's Leaving History textbook when I was in fourth grade, and I made it my own, and I read that, and that was about history from the fall of the Roman Empire to the First World War. So there was plenty of background before I discovered Mao and Stalin, but I remember thinking of the story of Mao, that it was an amazing insight into China and the whole question of the upheaval and at least ostensibly a demand for liberty. Because it turned out to be anything but liberty once the communists took over. But the story was a gripping drama. And, of course, it was a drama in the real world, unlike The Lord of the Rings, which, much as I loved it, was a fantasy, and I was very clear about that. And Stalin was, to me, like Sauron. He was the Dark Lord. The Kremlin became the real-world counterpart to the Dark Tower and the KGB with the Black Riders, and so the comparison was readily apparent, to my boyish mind at least.
And what did you decide to do after school?
Well, when I finished year 12, I suppose I had a reasonably imaginative secondary schooling, or at least I tried to make it so. I did debating and public speaking and acting, and notwithstanding that, I managed to get, I was stuck to the school, and so I was able to get into law, and everybody had said to me, "You should do law, you'll be a QC, you've got the gift of the gab, and you're very good with words generally." So I decided to do arts law at Monash University, But I wasn't actually quite clear what doing law would involve because I didn't know any lawyers. My parents didn't know any lawyers. I didn't know any professionals at all, and in the first 6 months or so at Monash, I found that my school buddies were dropping out all over the place. They just found the transition to university overwhelming. And my initial attitude was, well, that's not me because I'm the smartest guy in the room. I'll sail through. But one day, in July, I was sitting in the bowels of the library at Monash, and I had an essay that I was supposed to be writing, and I just suddenly thought, why exactly am I here? I haven't thought this through. I don't know who I am. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know how the world works. There's so much that I haven't done. And I wrote down a little manifesto for myself about the kind of person I'd like to be and what I'd like to do. And impulsively, and one would have to say from a purely prudential point of view, recklessly, I dropped out of university that afternoon. And I remember ringing home, and Mum and Kate said to me, Kate being my second oldest sister, well, how about you just come home this afternoon and think about it over the weekend? And if you still want to drop out on Monday, you can do it. I said, nope, I'm dropping out. And it was one of those life-changing decisions. But to come more directly to your question about what I then wanted to do, I started to build up a library. I took up bodybuilding. I took up piano, and I just tried to broaden myself as a human being. And when I went back to university, I didn't go back to law. I did a liberal arts degree at Melbourne University.
So was university free when you were doing it?
Yeah, it was, by comparison with now. I mean, one would probably have to say that had it not been, it would have been even more foolish of me to drop out of law than it was. But it's worth, I think, in retrospect, saying that the manifesto I wrote for myself was an imaginative one, not a silly one, really. And I have done it. I've fulfilled everything I had hoped to. It's just taken me my whole life.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get a better picture of you in the library and like what those consequences would be. But I guess if you were living at home still.
I was. And in fact, although I had decided in that little manifesto that I wanted to be independent, for some reason it didn't occur to me to move out of home in order to be more independent. It wasn't until 1981 that I did. That was my honours year, and I moved into Ormond College on the campus at Melbourne University, and that was a very good thing to have done. I was in a different environment, living away from home for the first time, at the age of 24, and I met a lot of people, including some who are friends to this day. And I also met visiting scholars, and one of them in particular was a professor of international law from Tufts University, from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Boston. And I introduced myself to him. It would have been towards the end, I think, of first semester. And he was a worldly kind of guy. He would have been, I'd say, roughly the age then that I am now. And he was indulgent. We talked for at least an hour, and then he said to me, well, young man, I've got just one question for you. When it comes to the world of ideas, do you see yourself as a priest or an explorer? And I said, oh, an explorer every day of the week. He said, well, I've got just the degree for you. And he described the Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy that they run at the Fletcher School. And he said, so here's my recommendation. You sit the graduate records exam. I'll send you our catalogue. I'm going back to Boston within a few weeks. And I'll see you there in the fall. And he sent the catalogue, and I'll always remember when it arrived, it had a gold cover, and I laid it out on the desk in my little room at Ormond, and I was blown away. I thought, look at this, all the seminars and elective options and visiting scholars. Wow. And what passed through my mind is I feel like a provincial squire has just discovered that Camelot exists, and I want to be a knight at the round table. That was the mood.
And then what happened?
Well, I sat the graduate records exam, and I was offered places at the Fletcher School, at Harvard, and at Princeton, but I didn't have any money, and they needed $20,000 for the first year. So I couldn't go. It was that simple. When you asked before about university here being free, it was, yes, and so I could go, and I could do what I chose, but not so in the United States. And for the first time in my life, I realized, well, it's all very well to be good, but if you don't have money, there are barriers. and this was one of them. And so I was faced with a choice. What do I do at this point? Because, the years were ticking by and I had to find a way to earn a living. And, going back and starting from scratch with a law degree seemed like a very long road. And besides, I was very interested now in international affairs. So I fell back on what I've always called Plan B. I went to ANU and did a PhD in international relations. But it didn't have anything like the riches of the Fletcher degree. There weren't all the visiting people coming from the State Department or the Pentagon or even from DFAT and Defense. It was just a university thing. It was a dissertation. There was no coursework. My supervisors were frankly useless. So it was sink or swim with a big topic, and I swam. I chose to do a study of U.S. counterinsurgency strategy in Southeast Asia and Central America throughout the Cold War. I always remember when I gave my statement of intent, was a senior scholar there, Ben Kirkfleet, who was a specialist on the Philippines, which was one of my nominated case studies. And he said, Paul, this is not a PhD you're proposing to take on. This is a life's work. But I got it done in 6 years. The examiners extolled it as a model of how PhDs ought to be, and that you might have thought would have led to a good postdoc in the United States and a career, but I couldn't find a path forward. Nobody was offering me anything, and I was over 30 by now and had no money at all, and so I thought I simply got to get a job, and the logical thing was to apply to work in the federal government in defence or foreign affairs, and my reasoning was, let's go for defence first, because it's probably going to be easier to get in as a graduate recruit in defence than to get into the diplomatic service. And once the PhD is passed, and assuming that it goes okay, I could either switch to the diplomatic service or finally do a postdoc or maybe move into intelligence in defence. So I applied to defence, and there's another whole story in that.
So had you worked at all to support yourself, like through part-time work or whatever, or, when you're at school still, were you working?
Or not you at school, but at university, certainly. Yeah, in honours year, for example, I had two part-time jobs. One was working as a cleaner at Royal Melbourne Hospital from 4 in the morning until 8 in the morning. So I'd be up before dawn, I'd be down to the hospital and work for 4 hours, have a bit of breakfast in the canteen there, and then start my day's study. And the day's study wouldn't end until 11 p.m. And so I got about 5 hours sleep at night. On Saturdays, I worked at the MCG as a ticket seller at football games. And I started the year full of beans. I'd been for a fortnight's hike in Tassie before the first semester started. And I used to work out a lot in those days, and I was full of beans. But by the end of the year, I was knackered. And I did an extra subject into the bargain, because when I got to the end of third year and it was time to select a thesis for my honours year, I realised something that for some reason nobody had drawn to my attention, which is a logical enough thing, but that is you can't do a thesis in a subject that you haven't actually studied. And I hadn't studied Australian or British or American history. I'd studied French history, Russian history, Reformation history, which is mostly continental, and classical studies. And what was I going to do a thesis on? I didn't have the languages. So I went to my French history lecturer and I said, well, in fact, what I'd like to do is a thesis on the student rebellion and general strike in France in May 1968, because it was the emblematic youth revolt of the 60s. But I'd need French to do it. Do you think I could learn enough French on the fly while doing the thesis to bring it off? And he smiled and he said, anybody else? I'd say, no way. You? I'd say, sure, have a go. So I did. That was in the honours degree, because that's before the PhD. I also, during those years, would work during the summers at the Victorian Railways, on the platform at Flinders Street. And for 2 of those summers, that was a midnight shift. So I'd come into work at 11 p.m. and finish my shift at 8 a.m. And, of course, your body clock gets thrown completely out of whack, and it was only starting to adjust when the summer's over and it's time to shift back to daylight hours. That was an interesting experience.
Wow. What were you doing on the platform?
What was I doing? On the first summer, it was a day job, so I was on the platform just sort of as an assistant to the platform master, because there's a lot of people around in those days, staff, wasn't all automated the way it is now. The second two, I was on a night shift, and so I did cleaning jobs and more or less security jobs, just sort of wandering around, making sure things were okay, and then I would collect or check tickets when people were coming in or going out in the mornings, because in those days you didn't have the electric barriers where people just pass a card. It's all old technology. There wouldn't be such a job these days.
There is in the UK for some reason.
Is there?
There's lots of people working on the platform and on, really even though there's automated ticket barriers, there's still people working there. So, and what was the motivator for you to have those part-time jobs? Like, what did it mean for you to be making money at that point?
Oh, I just needed basic money if I wanted to buy books, which I was doing, of course. I was building up a library, and even when I really should have spent what little money I had on a few more clothes, on a reasonable social life, but overwhelmingly I spent it on books, and I was a total bookworm. A great friend of mine who I met at Ormond and who is still a good friend says that he remembers when he first entered my room at Ormond, and he realised that it was wall-to-wall books. And not only that, but any book he picked up, it looked like I had read that book. It was annotated and underscored and everything, That was the way I lived. And to some extent it still is. I've just become a little more chilled out as I grew older.
So how many hours a day were you reading?
Well, one way to answer that is, people have asked me at intervals over the years, how do you find the time to do all this reading? And my standard response is, that's the wrong question. The question you should ask is, how do I find the time to do all the other normal things that people do? To which the answer is, I don't. I read.
That's what normal things?
Oh, well, hobbies, sports, social life, dating. I didn't have a normal social life. I'd fall in love, but I was a complete klutz when it came to courting girls. I didn't have the first idea, and it never really worked out very happily. And when I became unhappy about that, I just buried myself in my books again. And consequently, I became very good at reading and understanding and writing, but not very good at being happy and well-adjusted.
So you were just so interested in that information, like you just wanted to consume more and more.
Yeah, I was a sponge really, but it wasn't aimless reading. I was very purposeful. And I remember one day, still an undergraduate, I walked into the book co-op, as it then was, the bookshop on campus, and I was just browsing with fascination and all sorts of different sections of the bookshop. And the image that came to me was that my effort to understand the whole box and dice, how the world and the cosmos worked and how history had gone and where we fitted into it and why you've had revolutions and religions and so on. I wanted to understand all this stuff, that it was like a grid, and every new book I read could be assigned a place that had added knowledge and understanding to this part of it or that part of it, And in a sense, that's the way I've built up my library and my understanding. And I think it's for that reason that various people for quite a few years have called me a polymath, and because most people are driven for practical reasons or personal interest to specialize. I've never specialized in any meaningful sense.
So the kind of big question was, how does the world work? And then it's like, how have we ended up here? And then it's like seeing what's happened in history. How did that happen? Why did this person do that? Yeah. How did this group of people end up fighting with this group of people? Or is that the kind of...
Yes. I mean, to put it in its simplest terms, from the point of view of natural science, I want to understand deep time and cosmology. What is and where do we and our planet fit into the larger scheme of things? From the point of view of being human, I want to understand, how did human beings evolve and how have they conducted themselves on the planet, and what about this last little blip of time, which we call history, in which we've exploded in numbers and inventiveness and taken over the whole place. I wanted to understand all of that. And So, on every aspect of that, I've got shelves of books. And I might read a lot of the time, but I still can't find enough time to read all the things I want to. But I do have a more balanced life than I used to.
And did that desire to learn all of this come from really early on?
Well, I think it did, but it's one of the mysteries of human psychology and cognitive development, right? That I think my parents treated all of us much the same. I wasn't treated differently. I wasn't given special tutoring. I wasn't urged to read any more than anybody else. I just took to reading. And why, therefore, I became addicted to reading, and passionate about understanding everything, to the point where I would spend almost all the income I could get as a young person on books, and built up a library, which by the time I went to Canberra to do a PhD, there were 3,000 books. And my younger siblings have said for years that because I had to leave it behind me and go to Canberra, there's no way to put it in Canberra. They grew up in awe of this collection of books. There'd been no such library in the house when I was their age, but when they're little, there are these shelves and shelves of books on every conceivable topic, and they would just think, wow, look at this, and so it affected their sense of what one might do. And the three youngest ones, my brother Andrew and my youngest sisters, Genevieve and Leonie, actually then became, in a lot of ways, the most intellectually curious and self-confident of my siblings, because they could see a world of possibilities that was far wider than had been available when I was little. And I remember when I was on field work, and I visited your parents in Boston, and I received a letter from Jen, who would have then been in early secondary school, I think. And she said, my dear brother Paul, how is your fantastic world trip going? I'm sure you're going to become famous. And I wrote back to her, well, the trip is very interesting, but let me assure you that a lot of people travel and they don't necessarily become famous for that reason. And a lot of people become famous for really bad reasons.
And so, yeah, the relation here is that your mother is my nana's sister.
Yes.
Older sister.
Yes.
So what happened with the 3,000 books when you went to Canberra?
They had to remain, most of them, at my parents' place, and they remained there for years. I never had the whole library with me in Canberra when I was doing a PhD, but since I was working on this massive project and I had to concentrate on it, I didn't particularly need a lot of the other stuff, but I didn't dispose of it. And what I've done since then, that of course was many years ago now, we're going back 40 years, is I eventually got a place of my own and housed it. And then I used to cull the library or prune the library every few years. I would get rid of books that I decided were now superfluous, that had been used and I didn't need them anymore, or in some cases I probably shouldn't have bought them in the first place, or they might be interesting, but I was never likely to get around to reading them, and too many other priorities. But the library kept filling up again. So I've got a bigger library now than I had then, even though I've lost count of the number of books I got rid of. And one of my favorite anecdotes about that process is I used to, when there were still secondhand bookshops and you could sell books for a modest sum, I used to go to a place on Elgin Street in Carlton, not far from where I live now. And the owners there got to know me, and they used to say to me, you must have the most amazing library because the books you get rid of are so interesting that we take some of them home for ourselves. And one day I walked in because I wanted to sell some more books, and they weren't there. They'd left a graduate student minding the store. Turned out he was doing a PhD in philosophy, and when I told him my name, because I wanted to leave a message for the owners, he said, "Oh, you're Paul Monk. I've got your copy of Charles Taylor's Hegel. I love your marginalia." I just love that story.
So I guess my question was more about the curiosity, because the books is just the medium, right? The books are serving this greater purpose, which is finding these answers. And so that kind of motivation must have come at a young age if you were already, sacking off
I think
breakup
that
ready to read.
as I said earlier, how the cognitive development of any given individual proceeds is a bit of a mystery because nobody has studied me. I haven't, I don't have a confident theory as to why I would have become the way I have. It just happened to me. It's a little bit like, and this is, as you're aware, it's a little bit like the experience of if you fall in love with somebody and your friends can't quite understand why you'd fall in love with that person. And then you stop and ask, well, why am I in love with that person? You can offer some vague explanations, but it's actually a very subtle and complex thing. As we discover when we try and build a relationship with somebody, that it can be a very fraught business, because human beings are complex beings. And so all I would say is what you might call a Kipling-esque just so story. I read The Lord of the Rings and it ignited my interest in understanding in a holistic way a whole world. And whereas there are many people churn out books about Tolkien's Middle-earth, and I'm often a bit bemused by that. I think, aren't there better things to do than be endlessly involved in a fantasy? I just made the shift as a child from that book out of fantasy to history and cosmology. And as it happens, so you have a question there.
Well, I was going to say, don't you think it's more connected with your life's purpose? Like this has ended up being your life's work. Like this is what you're driven by. Because people come on here, I guess that's kind of what this podcast is working out, like what drives people. And yours wasn't kind of, I want to make money and be independent and do this. It sounds like you kind of saw, oh, money is this annoying thing that's blocking me from doing what I really want to do, which is go and study at Harvard or Princeton or whatever.
Yeah.
But in order to get my needs met, which is like to read these books, I will have to work because this is the system we're in. So that's kind of how the motivation works, and then that's been your whole life, right? Continuing to learn.
Yes, it has. It just to follow up on the psychological link between that passion and The Lord of the Rings, when my wife Claudia first arrived in Australia and we were getting to know each other, I shared with her, among other things, my love of The Lord of the Rings, which she'd never read. And I shared some of my favorite passages from it with her. And the first of them was from the second chapter of the book, where Tolkien is saying that whereas hobbits generally in the Shire weren't interested in the outside world, they kept their heads down and lived very unpretentious lives. Frodo Baggins was very interested in the outside world, partly because his uncle Bilbo had wild adventures, and partly because he knew Gandalf, who was a big wheel in the world outside. And so he used to, accost elves and dwarves when they were passing through the Shire and say, what's going on out there? And they would tell him, well, it's getting pretty grim out there. There's wars away east and south, and orcs are multiplying in amounts, etc., etc. And then the very next sentence after that passage was, little of all this, of course, reached the ears of ordinary hobbits. And Claudia, though she hadn't read the book, immediately said, so there are ordinary hobbits and there are extraordinary hobbits. You're an extraordinary hobbit. And ever since then, her nickname for me has been Frodo Baggins. And whenever she calls me, even leaves a message for me on WhatsApp or whatever, she'll generally call me Frodo. It's just what she calls me. So Frodo's mission was to find the crack of doom and cast the ring in. I guess my mission, in a sense, is to figure out, what is the fate of the world, in a real sense. And would that there was something as simple as his mission to solve the world's problems. There isn't, of course, but that makes it only the more interesting.
So do you have an answer for us on what the fate of the world is?
No, because there isn't a simple answer to that. But I have, in recent months, thought of writing a piece in which I challenge the reader to engage in a thought experiment. And the thought experiment is twofold. First, we now know that the Earth has existed for roughly 4.5 billion years, and that there's been life of some form on it for about 3.8 billion of those years. And that it took the most inconceivably long period of time before you got anything other than single-cell organisms. Right? It took something like 3 billion years. And even after you got complex life forms, it took 500 million years before you got hominins. And even when you got them, it took 6.5 million years before you get anything resembling us. Right? I mean, specifically what we call sapiens, because we think we're clever. And in our history, as a species, goes back 300,000 years, but what we call history, where we've been running wild and taking over the whole planet, that's only about 10,000 years at most. Right? Now, I said, so there's a case to be made that the process of life on Earth is a kind of log curve, and the process is like that of the life of a star, and our species is a biological supernova. It's peak life, but it's life also burning out. We're going to destroy the planet because that's what we are. It's not because anybody wants to destroy the planet. It's the process. It's autonomic. Nobody planned it this way. And we, in our generation, live at a time where everything that we call progress is amazing, right? And we have so many privileges, material privileges, access to so much knowledge. And so it's easy to think, well, this is the good stuff. This is fine. This is good. Do more of this. It's easy to see why we would think that. But consider the possibility that those are just the side benefits of a process which doesn't have a future. Now, here's the real thought experiment. Suppose you draw the conclusion that where there's supernova, that's an explosion, that's all going to just fall to ashes in a relatively near future. 50 years, 500 years, what difference does it make? What does it make sense to do as an intelligent being if you think that's actually the fate of the world? That's the question. And that's a challenging question, it seems to me, whereas most of the time people don't think seriously about that. They worry. They have vague ideas. But for the longest time, people believe in some ideology of progress or some religion of salvation or nirvana or whatever. They don't really grapple seriously with the big questions in terms of the way the world functions. I've tried to do that. And I'm nearing, realistically, the end of my life. I might be here another 20 years, but maybe a good deal less, and certainly not much longer. And so I think a lot about these things now.
And so what would your answer to that question be?
What would I do if that was the reality? Yeah. Well, I try increasingly to live with this sense that whatever is done, whatever occurs in what we think of as time, occurs for real in the same way that fossils show us that there were creatures billions of years ago, or say not billions so much if they're fossils, but certainly millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years ago. But they're gone. And yet they really were there. And it's awesome that they were there, and nothing will ever change that. And I think to myself, if I live in such a way that I do things that seem intrinsically worthwhile, then nothing can undo that. Not my death, not the oblivion to which even my work passes, because it did actually happen. And I feel that especially at the moment with my poetry. I feel that the poetry is my greatest achievement, because it's distilling meaning and music, form, beauty out of my experience of time and the flux of human affairs, and communicating sensitively with people I care about. That seems to be intrinsically worth doing. It's not dependent on progress. It's not dependent on me living forever. It's not dependent on an ideology of the transformation of society, whether or not that's going to occur. It has intrinsic merit.
This sounds... I'm trying to think, this is reminding me of Buddhism for some reason. But this is reminding me of, this whole whatever you learn through meditation and about being in the present and...
Yeah, I've tended to shy away from Buddhism chiefly because, as I understand it, the Buddha teaches that the world is full of suffering, and the way to nirvana, to peace, is to eschew the passions that drive life in order to stop suffering and to not inflict suffering. I certainly endeavor not to inflict suffering, but I don't want to quell my passions for the sake of possible suffering.
I think that's one interpretation of Buddhism that isn't the one that I take. Because the Buddha tried that. He went off and, because he started with everything. Yeah. And then he went off and lived without anything, and he realized that wasn't the answer either. Or that's my understanding. Or have you read Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse?
Yes.
Yeah, that's how I like to see it. So it's like you have everything, you go and you live with nothing, and then you're like, okay, this still doesn't give the answer. Giving up all life's pleasures isn't the answer. And then he's like overindulges, tries this, and then he realizes the answer is like sitting by the stream, hearing the noise of the stream. All this other stuff, ideologies prescribing to this, we must shave our heads or we must, whatever. That's not where the answer is. And that sounds like your thing of like the intrinsic, doing something that's intrinsically makes sense.
Yeah, well, look, it could be. I haven't seen it that way. I also haven't been, I suppose, looking for a doctrine or a way taught by somebody else to then declare that I believe. I've been trying to live my own life according to my lights. And to bring it back to the question of the poetry, I don't write poetry by way of pretending I'm somebody else or imitating other poets or whatever. I endeavor to give expression to what I'm experiencing and understand. And I've found, when my book, The Three Graces, was published in July, I had a party here with about 20 friends. And I got quite emotional talking about how fulfilling it was to have written this particular book, as distinct from the others, because it was more personal, it was more creative, it embodied more meaning, it summed up, in a sense, my entire life. And the next book, which I see as its sister book, which, all being well, will come out next year, seems to me an even more beautiful thing to have achieved. So I say to people these days, if I'm remembered for anything after I die, I hope it will be for my poetry.
And how do you look back and think of all that other work you've done in your life?
Well, it's fed into this. When I wrote that little manifesto in the library at Monash all those years ago, what I wrote was that I wanted to be a traveled man. I wanted to be a poet. I wanted to learn how to love. I wanted to understand things. And I feel that in the poetry I've written in the last 2 or 3 years, all of that has come together. And in some respects, because I've put myself out there striving to achieve those things, they've started to come towards me. And what I express in the 10,000-word preface to Red Oak of the Moon Goddess, which is next year's book of poetry, is that beyond any expectation, beyond belief really, this woman for whom I've written these poems came to me. I didn't find her, I didn't chase her. She came looking for me, and what she wanted from me was poetry. And she was immensely literate. It was as if she'd been on a quest analogous to mine. She'd read so much. And when I wrote poetry for her, she understood it all, and she wanted more. And it was an extraordinary experience. And it's come to a point now, whereas I think I said to you just before we started recording, I wrote the preface to the book this week, and today I got the most astonishing text from her saying that she was utterly overwhelmed by the preface and that she wants to say that I'm her poet, and she loves me for that, and she always will. I mean, one could say, man, I've lived. That's the most amazing epiphany.
Going back to the manifesto you wrote, did you keep it?
Alas, I didn't keep the piece of paper. I probably did for some years, but it's long gone. I have an archive which consists of, hundreds of letters and 40 years of journals. I've got a lot of private papers, but that, alas, I don't have. And there are other things that seem to have disappeared. When I was an undergraduate, I used to write to serious scholars whose books I'd read in the US or the UK or whatever, and quite a few of them replied. And two of my favorites were George Steiner, the great literary critic who died only 2 or 3 years ago, and Walter Kaufmann, the Princeton philosopher and the specialist on Nietzsche, who died way back in 1980. Each of them wrote back to me, and I treasured those letters, but I can't find them anymore. I don't know what happened to them, and it baffles me because I would never have thrown them away.
What kind of things did you write to these people?
Well, I wrote to Kaufmann chiefly about Nietzsche because I'd read all Nietzsche's books by then as well as Kaufmann's books. And among the things that I said was that, people discuss Nietzsche's idea of the will to power, which is that there is will to power and nothing else. I said, but isn't that just a strange kind of metaphysical notion? I mean, why would we not simply study biology and grapple with the way life really is rather than assert over and above it that it consists of the will to power or any other abstract idea? And, questions of a similar nature. And he wrote back saying, all your questions do you credit, and I urge you to continue pursuing your studies. But if I was to answer all your questions, it would take quite a bit of time and thought. And I've got books that I'm still trying to write while there's still time, So it was a brief letter, but he wrote back. Steiner wrote a longer letter. I'd asked him questions about Heidegger and Plato and various things. And he wrote back, a page and a half, an aerogram. And but he said at the end of it, because I'd written in longhand, he said, please beg, borrow, or steal a typewriter.
So you were so interested in their work and you just wanted to learn more and understand more how they thought? Or were they and was that kind of every letter you wrote, whether it's received a reply or not, just engaging more in the content and asking more? Or were they kind of gratitude of this is such a beautiful piece of work?
Oh, I suppose that varied. But, generally with the senior scholars, given I was an undergraduate and way down here in Australia, it would be a one-off thing. I would write to them and they would get a letter back. But the letters were, even though Kaufmann's was brief, he obviously read my letter and engaged with it. But it wasn't an ongoing correspondence. Most of my correspondence over the years was, personal.
Yeah, but I mean, what was your motivation to write the letter? All these letters you wrote.
I read their books and I thought, these are the kinds of books I respect. They're teaching me things. I'd like to be a writer like this. I want to pursue these kinds of inquiries, and so I wanted to make contact with them and in a sense, I suppose, get inside their world. What was it like to be George Steiner or Walter Kaufmann, or Barrington Moore Jr. or Del Himes or others that I wrote to, And I think if I could have written to some of the people, who were deceased by then, but whose books they read, I would have done that. And I would have loved, for example, to write a letter to Hannah Arendt. Do you know who Hannah Arendt is or was? So she was a Jewish German philosopher who fled Nazi Germany in 1933, ended up in the United States, and she was known for a number of books, the first of which, published in the 1950s, called The Origins of Totalitarianism. And I remember when I was doing my fieldwork for the PhD in 1984, I discovered a newly published biography by a woman called Elizabeth Young Brewell. And on the back of it was a picture of Hannah when she was a young woman. And she was highly intelligent. You could see this in her dark, intense eyes and her hair tied back. And she had a cigarette, and I was thinking, oh, that's my kind of woman. I sort of fell in love with Hannah, even though she had died in 1975 before I ever read this biography. She was the age of my grandmother, but the photo of her as a young woman, and I loved her writing, and I loved the quality of her mind. So it's a matter of trying to connect with minds that you feel drawn to or admire. And I've had the privilege, I suppose, in my reading of forming that connection, not directly with the writers of most of the books, but through reading them closely, feeling as though I'm in their company. And, it's an aspiration to belong in that company, I suppose. But the question is, who makes the judgment as to whether you do, and whose judgment counts for anything? And you can spend too much time, vainly trying to assess whether you're among the great public intellectuals or thinkers. You just need to do your best and leave it to others to assess. And all I can say is that in recent years, I have begun to feel, very privileged to move among these thinkers and be able to contribute at least modestly to public debate, important issues, and above all, to have become a poet and to find that the women for whom I write poetry really appreciate it. That's a profound experience.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I just want to go back to the manifesto.
Uh-huh.
So you, in this moment in the library, because it seems like such, a young age to have that kind of self-awareness that you need to figure out who you are and that you would take that. That's why I'm asking about, what were the financial costs and were you living at home? So it's like, okay, it's not a huge kind of financial cost to do, but still there must have been a cost in terms of, looking at what everyone else is doing. I guess you mentioned some of your friends had dropped out, but to say, okay, everyone, life's moving really quickly, everyone's off going, doing things, and I'm going to just step back and try and figure out who I am. And that I also would love to hear your thoughts on kind of like fate or spirituality or this kind of stuff we're talking about, because you could easily, and there could be a whole nother conversation on religion, but a religious person could see that, or a spiritual person could be like, that's their, that's this moment with God where he's telling you what your path in life is, and that's this manifesto you're channeling, and then that's how you've pursued the rest of your life, and everything's come to pass because that was your mission from God or the universe or whatever. And it's like, this is true.
I can't hear the words mission from God without thinking of the Blues Brothers. People do still talk a lot about God and religion, particularly on the global scene. And as I said at the start, I was raised a conservative Catholic, but I decided by the age of 18, before I started at university, really, I just didn't believe those things. It was, to me, there was a world of serious ideas going back thousands of years, if you understand where religion came from and what fundamentally it meant. But in the 20th century, it seemed to me, to pray and talk as if God or Jesus or Virgin Mary were here and he'd understand and change things for you or give you insight, struck me as delusional. I could never see that made sense. I was troubled by the fact that it appeared to make sense to millions of people and not to me. And I thought, does that mean I'm stupid? What am I missing? And so I spent a lot of time reading into the history of Christianity, into theology, into the Reformation. I studied Reformation history at the university. But far from persuading me that I was in error and that somehow there was revelation and there were miracles and there was a heaven up there, or in some sense, I thought, no, I don't believe any of that. I believe that the natural world is the world, period. And we human beings are unusual creatures because we've developed language and elaborate records which give us a world of ideas beyond that of any other creature of which we're aware. And that's amazing. And that's it. That's it. I have not the slightest expectation that there's what people call an afterlife. It's not, it's not something that I hope for or would like to believe. It just seems to me nonsense. It's like believing in a tooth fairy.
But how do you explain something like your calling in life? Or do you think it's just randomness, what any given person feels called to do?
I'm not sure about randomness, but I do think there's a great deal of randomness in what happens to us, and what it's incumbent upon us, if we want our lives to feel as though they hang together and as though we have some calling, is we have to invent for ourselves a story that we're comfortable to live inside. And when Claudia called me Frodo, she had, in a sense, put her finger on perhaps what happened to me. I never had crazy ideas about being Frodo Baggins, but I was influenced by this idea that there's a big world outside the commonplace and the everyday in which people around me appeared to be content to live. And I wasn't content to do that, with temperamental reasons. I mean, the rest of my family have done it, and they've done it well. But as Claudia said, I'm, in that sense, an extraordinary hobbit. I don't conform to that model, and I'm not at all complacent about what I've achieved. I'm gratified, in some ways, as I've remarked, particularly about how things seem to be going towards the end of my life. But if I could have my time again, I would do a whole lot of things differently. I would love to speak multiple languages. I'd love to be conversant with serious mathematics. I would have lived a little differently. I would have lived a saner, more convivial social life as a young man, instead of doing almost nothing but exercise, read and eat and sleep. I was a machine in some ways.
But you can learn these languages now, and you can get into maths now.
Well, in theory, but I've got half a dozen projects I'm working on right now, and there aren't enough hours in the day. I don't sit around twiddling my thumbs thinking, well, I could learn languages, but I'm feeling lazy. I don't feel lazy. I'm consumed with what I'm doing. And we haven't touched on this, I spent 12 years grappling with cancer between 2004 and 2017, really. And then I had a kind of chronic fatigue for a couple of years after that, where it was difficult to do very much. And I'd no sooner recovered from that than COVID set in and we're under lockdown. And by the way, we got to the end of last year and I felt I've overcome all that and I'm okay. I'm still here. And I'm going to get back in the gym. And then I started getting afflicted by gout, so all of these things sap your energy and time passes. And, 18 years since I first got the melanoma, and I've gone from being 48 to being 66, and no one lives forever. But in that time, I've written and published 12 books, and 11 books with the 12th on its way. And I've traveled a lot, and I've had some extraordinary relationships, So it's been a full while. But you can't do everything. I guess that's the lesson.
Unless you just figure out a way to live till 150.
Well, many of the people I admire died younger, much younger than I am now. And a couple of years ago, I was seized by this idea, and I put together a table which began with just 20 lives, but ended up with 360 lives of people who are known and remembered, if only by specialists, for their achievements of various kinds: sportsmen, musicians, actors, statesmen, scientists, all sorts of people, all of whom had died younger than I already was. I was then 63. The average age at which these people died was 43. And yet it included many people who were famous, and among them many poets, who had written poetry that has sort of never been out of print, as it were, in some cases for 2,000 years or more. And yet they died much younger than I already was. And it reminds me of a delightful quip by Tom Lehrer, the satirical songwriter of the 1960s, who, in talking about Alma Mahler, who married Gustav Mahler and several other men in her life, he said, in describing the men she'd married, he says, "It's people like this who make you realize how little you've accomplished. It's a sobering thought, for example, that Mozart, when he was my age, had been dead for 2 years." And I've long thought, well, if Mozart achieved everything he did by the age of 37, then none of us have any excuse for complaining about, what we've done or how much time we've got. You need to take life by the horns, as it were, and say, what am I up for? What am I capable of doing, of achieving, of giving? And people have all sorts of different goals. I gave a talk to a law firm at their request some years ago about goal setting and aspirations, and I used the efforts by George Mallory and his colleagues in the early 1920s to climb Mount Everest. They tried 3 times, they failed every time, and Mallory died in the final attempt. But we admire him for what he has attempted to achieve. We admire the sense of transcendence and endeavor that led him to keep trying to climb that colossal pile of rock and ice. And as some people would say, and the Dalai Lama at the time did, that he couldn't understand why anybody would do such a futile and absurd thing. Why are you trying to get to the top of that massive rock and ice? What possible purpose could it serve? But that's an existential question, isn't it? Why do we do anything? What is intrinsically worthwhile? Is there any definitive answer to that, or is it something that has a lot to do with our personal temperaments and experiences? I've, as I said, written a body of poetry now that those few people who have been reading it, and most importantly the woman for whom I wrote them, think is just wonderful. Will that be the general opinion? Who can say? Will the poetry outlive me? Will it become a literary classic? Who can say? But I'd love for that to be the case. But I don't know how you ensure that it is.
But I guess, why does that matter? Like, if you're not going to be around to ever know that?
Well, because I derive my standards from looking at poets long dead whose work we still read, and I think that's what I would like. That motivates me to do it now. And obviously, I'm not going to be around. I mean, take Catullus, for example. He died in 50 BC at the age of 30 of tuberculosis. He only wrote 1 book of poetry. We still read it after 2,000 years and more, right? That book barely squeaked through the Dark Ages. It vanished for hundreds of years, and then a single copy turned up, and just by the merest thread survived. But once the printing press was invented, it's never been out of print. And I would love to think that the books of poetry I'd published, I've written far more poetry than he did, will endure. But of course, if I'm right about the supernova thing and the fate of the Earth, then there's no long-term future. And so I fall back on the idea that what I've done is and needs to be perceived as intrinsic in its merit and worthwhileness. And I feel right now, when I contemplate what I've done, that it has been. That I could die tomorrow and think, there's lots of other things I could have done, but boy, that was worthwhile. I think that's a nice way to be.
Yeah. Yeah, this is giving me a lot to think about. Because have you ever, in these 12 years when you were fighting cancer and with chronic fatigue, did you suffer, or even earlier than that, did you suffer from any periods of depressive periods, or kind of what's the point in doing anything? What does all this mean? Which I think, a lot of, poets, I think out of all professions, poets is the highest rates of suicide. And I think for anyone who studies philosophy and gets into, you were talking about Nietzsche and, nihilism, if you go down those rabbit holes, have you ever ended up thinking like, well, does it all mean anything? And if it doesn't, then why am I here? And then how do I have the will to carry on?
I have certainly been through periods of depression, and in fact, probably the darkest period was when I got to a point in the mid to late 1990s where, having been unable to go to the US for my graduate studies because I didn't have the money, having done a PhD that was acclaimed by its examiners as outstanding, having got into defense and got into intelligence and decided, well, they want me to work on East Asia, I'll make a career on this then. I get to be head of the China desk, and then they won't develop me. I seek to find a path to move to Hong Kong and get into merchant banking to be properly paid for being a good analyst, and I was unable to pull that off either. I had my romantic relationships weren't working out, and I just hit the wall. Nothing seemed to be working. And I remember having a conversation with a great woman friend who I'm still friends with, and she said to me, this is way back in 1996, whatever you do, don't commit suicide because you'll be missing out on so much. And I recalled that little conversation in an essay I wrote at some point in the past 12 months on suicide, because I said, I can look back now and say that the best years of my life, my greatest achievements, have all occurred since then. And so had I taken my life, I really would have missed out on a great deal. I'm reminding you of Benedict, I guess, am
I? No, I'm thinking, I'm very emotional hearing you say that. I'm thinking about myself, and I guess so many people who I know now through doing this podcast. I guess it's opened me up to people to tell me their hardships and how they're struggling, and that's just like a really good answer to keep going. And I don't know, that's just a really good message for me, I think, because it's hard, especially now. I'm sure so many people will be feeling this in London. It's so cold here so early, like it's -2 today, and we're only at the start of December, and heating, like the cost of living, and it's just even after Brexit, after COVID, it's like things still aren't running properly, and it's such an expensive city, and it's just like this mood that everything's so difficult.
Yeah.
And I guess that's when you hear all the, war and everything getting more expensive, and then there's constant strikes, and I think these times, especially if you're someone who's susceptible to kind of depressive moods, it's like even more just like, what's the point? Like, how am I going to get through this? But from what you're saying, it's like you just, I guess it's like going upwards, into a dark tunnel. Actually, this is what my therapist said to me this week, which I think is so good. It's like you can't, it's like you don't want to stay where you are, and you're not going to go backwards, but all you can see in front of you is a dark tunnel uphill.
Uh-huh.
But I just did not expect to get this emotional. Anyway, but it's like you just have to keep going. And then trusting, I guess, as you said, that there will be, as cliche it is, like light at the end. And there will be like all the amazing things that will happen in life can only come once
if
you
you're
decide
alive.
to keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. But, this morning I was editing for Claudia an essay or a magazine article she's drafted. But she's in Venezuela, as you know, right? She's Venezuelan, and she's been back there for many years now. And it's a mess, Venezuela. It's in far worse condition than the UK. And this article is saying, many people in Venezuela are saying, oh, the future is just all black. Whoever leaves last, turn out the lights. I've got to head to the airport. That's the only way out of this mess. And she says, but consider this, all of that mood is based on an assumption that the present gives us the future, that it's predictable, that it's inevitable, that there's nothing to be done. Whereas she said, history is full of examples of where people in intractable circumstances bring new futures that can't be predicted into being. And we need to do that. Do we want a prosperous future in Venezuela? Do we want a free future? Well, then let's invent it. Let's bring it about. And I helped to polish up the essay for her. And let me say, going back to that conversation with my friend in Canberra, I didn't respond to her at that point by saying, "Oh, I'm sure you're right, and there's lots of good things ahead of me," because I was depressed. I wasn't at all sure they were. It's only in retrospect that I can say, well, it's now 26 years since then, right? That's a long time. But all my books have been written in that time. Most of my foreign travel has occurred in that time. My most amazing relationships with women have occurred in that time. My poetry's all been written in that time, bar some trivial early stuff, right? So I would have missed out on an astounding amount had I succumbed to depression and ended my life in the same way that I would have if the cancer had killed me, as the doctors thought 10 years ago it was going to do in short order. I would never have written most of my books. I wouldn't have written the 2 big volumes of poetry I've written in the last few years. I wouldn't have met some of the people I've met in recent years, right? But you couldn't predict that, right? So what one can say is that if better futures are to come about, a precondition is that you stay alive. Then you have to invent a reason for doing that, because it's not self-evident. It's not an abstract thing. And the meaning of life is not something that's out there for you to cling to. You have to create the meaning of your life. And for many people, that's tough because, frankly, their lives are pretty ordinary and their challenges are formidable. I've been fortunate to live in Australia in a lot of ways. I've been fortunate that I've been gifted enough to do well at school and university and at pretty much any intellectual task I took on. That's a good fortune. It's not something I can claim credit for. Sure, I worked hard, but if I didn't have the ability, I couldn't have done these things, right? If I hadn't done it, and I was writing this in the preface to the poetry book this week, if I hadn't spent decades reading relentlessly and trying to write poetry, I could not, when Rachel appeared as a highly literate muse and wanted poetry from me, I couldn't have written it. I wouldn't have had the skills. I wouldn't have had the resources at my fingertips. And what I discovered is that through her, all that reading, the whole Western canon, going back 3,000 years, came to life. It was extraordinary experience. But what I would say is more generalizable, is that if it's cultivated, if it's taught to people, if they open their eyes a bit to it, then each in our own way, we can discover how extraordinary it is to be alive. To be the fact that we are alive at all, that we can pause and contemplate other life forms, flowers, clouds, the earth, our pulse. This is extraordinary. And this is it. So if we distract ourselves by thinking, no, this is just a world of illusion and sin and suffering, and there's a better world elsewhere, we're missing out, to be honest. There isn't anything elsewhere. There is the actual world and what can be brought into being and appreciated in it and through it. That's it. So give it your best shot.
When did you come to these realizations? Because I guess it's all perspective, right? And you have this gratitude and way of looking at things, and yeah.
Well, when I read Nietzsche as a youngster, it blew my conservative provincial Catholic world to smithereens, and suddenly the world expanded. It was like, wow, think of all the possibilities, right? But I was very young, and I didn't know what I was capable of doing. And it's been very interesting in the last couple of years, looking back and thinking, well, I'm now much older than Nietzsche was when his life came to a screaming halt. I can read his work now and assess its merits judiciously, which I couldn't as a young man. And in a lot of ways, I've lived the life, broadly speaking, that he urged. His central concept, other than the will to power, is what he calls the Übermensch, the overman, sometimes translated as Superman. And, it's taken grotesque forms at times. But what he essentially means is to be fully human is to consciously shape the meaning, the character, the purpose of your life, and to seek to transcend the simple and rudimentary animality that being an organism entails. And that's uniquely possible for humans. He says, we're still an unfinished species. We have possibilities, we have destinies. And the Übermensch, the higher, as he would say, man, or he was a bit of a misogynist, but one ought to say, and I certainly do, women, right, can set goals and transcend mundanity, transcend banality, transcend brutality, be creative. And I would now look at my life and say, I can reasonably claim to have lived by those imperatives. And I do feel, there are lots of ways to live. They don't necessarily entail reading mountains of books and writing poetry. We talked about George Mallory climbing Everest. There are things that people do, in sport, in music, in science, in many fields, which are extraordinary, and which, in the best cases at least, enable them to feel, as I freely confess I feel now, wow, that was worth doing. I look back at my life now and I think, for all the moments of misgiving or depression that I had over decades, it was all worthwhile. It was all worthwhile. And the paradox of that is, instead of leading me to say, I'm determined to live forever, I think I could die peacefully. I don't intend to die anytime soon, but I could die peacefully because of what I've already done. I think it's been worth doing.
And did you feel this way when you were faced with, I guess, the diagnosis that you would die from the cancers?
Yeah, well, specifically back in 2007, I think it was, David Speakman, who was my cancer surgeon, had already cut quite a few tumors out of me. He said to me, look, he said, if you were a breast cancer patient and this was your 6th occurrence, I'd be saying you might want to cash in your insurance policy and have a nice holiday because it's not going to get any better from here. And he looked pretty grim-faced. And I just said to him straight off the bat, thanks for being candid with me, but I've never lived in La La Land. I don't need a jolly. If you're telling me my number's just about up, I'm going to finish the book I'm writing. Man, we'll die of something. If this is going to be what kills me, I'll look it in the eye as I go down. And the book that I was writing at the time was called The West in a Nutshell. It was 30 essays on the whole nature of civilization. And I got it written and I wasn't dead. And so we kept going, and I had operations 7 and 8 and 9. And after the 9th operation, I said to him, so you were about to, write me off at 6. We've now got 9 and you seem phlegmatic about it. What gives? And he said to me, well, you see, we get a small number of patients who get recurrent melanoma in a limb for years and years without it ever metastasizing. We don't know why that happens, but it's beginning to look as though you want it there. And I said, oh, okay. So when you say a small number, what are we talking about, 5 or 10% of melanoma patients? And he said, oh, no, nothing like that. I can think of perhaps 3 such cases out of the many hundreds we currently have in our books. I said, now you've got me interested. So I'm a statistical freak. This is a vanishingly small number, a fraction of 1%, right? And then we had operations 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, all still on the right leg, right? It was a nuisance, but it wasn't life-threatening. But after operation 16, which was a big one, where they cut out 14 tumors and had to do a skin flap because they couldn't do a suture, I said to him, this is beginning to look serious now. If you think it's now going to metastasize in the next 12 months, you better tell me, because I'll have to reorganize my life to deal with that. And he said, oh, if I thought it was going to metastasize, I'd certainly tell you, but I think it was going to metastasize. I would have done it years ago. I don't think it will. And within 6 months, it did. And that was back in 2013. It's 9 years ago. And then the single most remarkable part of the story, I would say, occurred, which is that I declined, after discussing it with the medical oncologist, to take any drugs for it for the first year, because he said the best drug we've got only works in 20% of cases, and when it works, it only is effective for a median period of about 9 months, and the whole time you're on it, you'll feel pretty shitty, like you've got the flu or something. And I said, well, okay, fine, so let's not bother, because I've got a book I want to finish. And if I'm feeling shitty, I might not be able to get the book finished. And there's an 80% chance I'll die anyway. So I'd rather have a good 12 months, write the book, and then face the music, rather than lousy 12 months, not accomplish anything, and go over the waterfall anyway. You could hardly believe I said that, but I was perfectly serious. And over that next 12 months, I didn't have any treatment, and all but one of the metastatic tumors vanished spontaneously. Now, why? That they couldn't believe it. David spoke to me again with a big smile, and he said, this is amazing, and it's very good. I have no medical explanation for why that occurred. But the assumption was that my immune system had found a way, probably because the melanoma had been in my body for so many years by then, to tackle it. And it did so. So that was pretty amazing. And here I am.
Then, sorry, go on.
Oh, well, there was one stubborn tumor that was holding out in my groin, and we debated a lot as to, what should be done. And finally, I decided, right, let's try the drug. And the first drug didn't work, so they tried a new and better one, and that didn't work. Then they tried a third one, and that didn't work. They tried a fourth one, and it sort of worked. The tumor shrank. In fact, they declared victory, a bit like George Bush in Iraq. Remember the oncologist saying to me, "You're the cat with 9 lives. You've done it. It's gone." But he showed me the scan and the pathologist report, and I said to him, "Well, that isn't altogether gone. That there's indications there. There's still some tumorous material." He said, "Oh, no, that's just noise. You're fine." But he was wrong, because after a year it started to grow again. And so they then tried to cut it out, but they found that they couldn't, because it was too close to my iliac artery, and I could very likely have bled out on the table. And so they then used radiation to knock it out, and that worked, and that was at the end of 2017.
And you haven't had a problem since?
No, I haven't had any new tumors since 2013. That was the holdout, and it held out for 4 years. We finally knocked it out, and I was declared in complete remission in March 2018, and I've been fine, except, for the residual fatigue, because I'd had so many anesthetics and so many drugs. But, I'm here, and I'm doing my best work. There's no doubt in my mind the work I've been doing in the last couple of years, particularly both in poetry and prose, is the best work I've done.
And what got you through that long battle?
Oh, it's hard to say, because, when I was declared in remission, I remember, friends and family threw a party, and they're all saying, "Oh, congratulations, you fought such a good fight." And I said, I'm not sure that I personally deserve much credit for this. I lucked out, really. I mean, I happen to have an immune system that was extraordinarily resilient, but it's not something I engineered. I didn't change my lifestyle because of the cancer. I'd always lived a pretty moderate lifestyle. I just kept on living the way I always had. So I was fortunate in the way things panned out, but I don't think it was my doing. I would say, on the other hand, that it concentrated my mind because I thought, look, this could go pear-shaped. I might not have very much longer. And so I thought about, well, what are my priorities if I've got limited time? And of course, we all have limited time. We just don't know how limited it is, right? What are my priorities? And I thought fundamentally there are two things. One is not to waste time, but to create what's in me to do while I can, which meant I always had a book on the go. And the second is to prioritize communication with people I cared about and to make sure that I hadn't left unsaid things that I wanted to say to them, whether of forgiveness or love or whatever else. Because I always had a book on the go, I always had a project which, when I was capable of getting up and working, gave me a focus, something to do. And I said I was fortunate in my immune system. I was also fortunate in my friends and family. They were very warm and caring, and people would come over and cook and clean for me when I was incapable of doing those things. They clearly cared about me. And Claudia, although we hadn't lived together since 2007, she was very concerned, and it's a sign of the integrity of her care for me that one day I talked on Zoom and I said, okay, we need to talk about my will. And she said, no. And I said, yeah, we need. I've got to drop the will and you'll be the primary beneficiary. And she said, I don't want to talk about your will. And I said, but we need to sort it out. And she says, no, I don't want to talk about your will because you're not going to die. And I said, well, I very well could. And she said, no, you can't die because I need you. From a certain point of view, she speaks is irrational, right? But it showed that her attitude to me was she wanted me in her life. She wasn't interested in stuff from me, money from me. That didn't mean anything. It was me, my presence in her life that counted. Right? These are important moments. And I think when any of us have that experience that somebody else whom we ourselves care for cares that deeply about us, it reinforces our capacity and will to live.
Mm.
We realize we're not alone.
But it sounds like you had radical acceptance as well, that you could die.
Yeah, it did. The idea of dying didn't itself hold the slightest fear for me. My view was we all die, and a great many people, to my knowledge, either by name because they're relatively well known, if you've read as much as I have, or largely anonymous because they were killed in plagues and wars, or they died in childhood, and all sorts of things. They died. It happens. All creatures die. Dogs live short lives. Insects live vanishingly short lives. It doesn't reduce the fact that they're amazing beings. And the quality of our lives is not to be calculated by how long we live, but by who we are. And moreover, the world doesn't revolve around us. The world's a vast, amazing place. And each of us as an individual is a very vanishingly small part of that. We should be full of awe and wonder at the whole scheme that we're part of, but not get out of proportion and think that somehow it's unfair if all the best things don't come to us. Because, life isn't particularly fair, but it is extraordinary. It seems to me if we talk about, those who are genuinely deprived, and are a great many, what is it one would bring to them? A pile of material goods? Well, maybe the necessities, but surely what you really want to impart to people is a sense of the wonder of being alive, authentically, so that they can feel that there are meaningful things that they can do, connections they can make with others that make life seem an extraordinary experience. If our education systems were first class, or to be a bit more charitable when they are, it seems to me that's what they do. And in a lot of ways, to come full circle, that's what Kath Gill did when she read The Lord of the Rings to our class, because it injected in me a whole sense of, that's the role of poetry in life. That's the role of nature in life, of language, of mythology, of principle, of counseling, of heroism. It was all there in one package. And you didn't have to believe it because everybody accepted it was a fable, right? It wasn't the Bible, which people keep wanting to say, this is the truth, this is the whole box of lies. If in fact, to touch on that, we regard the Bible more as a set of stories. Some of them are amazing stories, they're terrific stories. But others are just really old-fashioned and often objectionable legal and moral codes that we shouldn't really particularly want any part of. And to say that it's the Word of God is a strange locution and one we should put behind us. It's an old book, a long history.
I guess I was lucky in my experience of Catholicism that I think in prep, the teacher telling us about Adam and Eve explained that it's not something that actually happened. It's to teach us something. So I went forward not really ever having a problem with Catholicism as it being something that you have to accept as truth. But I guess, that's not the same experience of
everybody. No, everyone. In fact, the official catechism of the Catholic Church still teaches that we must accept that Adam and Eve fell into sin, that original sin is a reality, because if it wasn't, then there wouldn't have been a need for Jesus to come and save us. And because that can't be the case, there must have been the fall. It's completely circular reasoning. And what we know from very sound archaeological and paleoanthropological work is that we are evolved beings, and we go back way, way back beyond any notion the writers of the Bible had about creation and the fall. And we didn't fall, we rose. We're an incredible species. Even if the end is coming soon, it's not an apocalypse in the religious sense, and it's not a punishment for our sins. It's just been a wild ride. If you go surfing and the waves get big, you might have an extraordinary time and end up tumbling off your board. That's the way life is.
So then what would you say to people who might get upset because they strongly hold on to the notion that we are destroying the planet and something can be done and needs to be done immediately?
Well, there are limits to what can be done immediately. But let me make clear that I don't for a moment mean to suggest that it doesn't matter that we're destroying the planet. And we're not simply destroying the planet. We're doing a lot of extraordinary things. If you look back over what's happened in the last, let's say, 3,000 years, there's been an enormous number of wars, diseases, massacres, there's been torture, there's been rape, there's all sorts of horrendous things, and nothing that we do now can undo the fact that all that happened. But along the way, there was the most amazing art and inventiveness and music. The fact that a Beethoven or a Mozart can exist at all, that we evolved the capacity to build musical instruments, to record music in notation and eventually electronically, that somebody could embody the skills involved in musical composition to the point of composing the works of Beethoven particularly. It's mind-boggling if you really stop and contemplate it. And if we take that idea I put out before, that ultimately everything perishes, we all die, all species die. More than 99% of all species of plant and animal that have ever existed on the planet's estimated are already extinct. In fact, there's a joke that 99.94% of species are already extinct, which to a first approximation means that all species are already extinct. Right? So I would say to such people, give it your best shot. There's lots of challenges out there to make the world a better place, to fend off disaster, to heal, to clean. Take it on. Just don't get too self-righteous about it. All right? Don't behave as if, for example, the people who provide and have provided for the last 100 or 200 years fossil fuels that have made possible the extraordinary prosperity and development that's occurred around the world in that time, that they've somehow been evil conspirators. They haven't been. And if we want a better future, then resentment, hatred, fear, etc., are not going to contribute to that. Innovation, vision, transformation, persuasion, creativity, they will. But there are no guarantees. And what we found in the 20th century is that radical revolution in the name of forcefully transforming society produces very often horrendous results. Right? There's no simple path to radical transformation. There's just ongoing work and commitment and integrity.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I guess to add to that fear, hatred, it's also division, or I guess those things create division, which then leads to violence and destruction and death and all these things that. So if you're trying to avoid those things, it just, yeah, it's because people are very, very passionate about things, which I think is good, but I'm very sensitive to when people are kind of making it like this group is bad or wrong, or this, seeing things black and white, creating division in politics, and that, which is a whole nother topic that we haven't talked about, but that's, kind of seeing someone who votes for this party is therefore evil, and it's like, it's like we need to move forward. If we're trying to move forward and solve big problems and make everything better for everyone, like saving the planet, for example, is presumably like for the greater good for everyone, like humans and plants and animals and everything.
Except like, that there are those who say that the human species is a bad lot, and so what we need to do is eliminate the human species. And no human beings saying this, of course, which is a paradox. But there is another paradox at work currently, where we have a lot of people saying that the cause of so much environmental destruction is that we're consuming too many resources and there's too many of us doing it. And yet very often the same people will say, we can't, of course, deny to the impoverished peoples of Africa, of South Asia, of the Middle East, of Latin America, the opportunity to live fully developed and prosperous lives. Well, frankly, it seems to me they're trying to have it both ways. I mean, so if you think there's too many human beings and the most prosperous of us consume too much, how can you then turn around and say that the other billions of people on the planet have a perfect right to live the same way? But where's that going to get you? Right? Conversely, if you say, oh, well, no, that won't work, we should keep them poor. Well, how do you justify that? And if you say we need to reduce the standard of living of people in the prosperous West, how do you expect to bring that about with any degree of justice or equanimity? Right? So there just aren't simple solutions to this situation. And that's because it has evolved, it's emerged. It's not a plot. It's not that some fundamental scheme was put in place to trash the planet. And it could be that we'll come unstuck. When I said earlier that this was a thought experiment, the supernova thing, I meant exactly that. It's a thought experiment. It's not me saying that is absolutely what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen. But if you do a thought experiment like that, you can get some sense of sober perspective about what it makes sense to do in life.
Yeah. I think I talk about this so much, but like how Bill Gates talks about, I don't know if you've read his book on how to avoid a climate crisis, that instead of looking at it as either we have to get rid of half the population of the earth, or some people just have to stay in poverty, or we destroy the environment. It's like, no, let's have both. Let's raise the standard of living of everyone and continue progress and avoid a climate disaster. And here are the creative solutions to do it. And that's the type of thinking that I love. That's like problem solving. We can have this. How do we do it? Well, humans are amazing. We have the ability to innovate, to think creatively. But this best happens when we work together and we listen to each other. And so I guess that's kind of the other point of this podcast, is to show, let's hear from all different people, and there's no labels, or there's no, I can't associate with this person but that's scary. It's scary in this world today where people, I don't know if the world's always been like that, and you would probably have a better understanding of that, but it feels scary to have a conversation with someone who has certain views, but that's really what I want to go against, because we're all humans and our views come from somewhere. And the only way for someone to, if maybe their views aren't great, for them to see an alternative is for them to actually be exposed to a different way of thinking. And they can only do that by being heard, rather than being like pushed underground.
It'd be interesting to have a conversation with Vladimir Putin right now, wouldn't it, on that head?
Well, yeah, because, he is a human as well, like us. And so what's he driven by? What's happened in his life? What are his fears? Or any person who does something that seems so, yeah. But generally, that's why I think it's good that we don't threaten violence against, even in like a place like Australia, the idea that people make violent threats against someone who votes for a different political party in a democracy. It's like, it's scary to me.
Yeah, there's a lot that's scary out there. And, I at times, I have thought over the years, less so now than in the past, that perhaps what drove me is that from very early on, when I switched from fantasy to the real world, I read things that were actually pretty grim. I mean, you read The Life of Stalin, or as I did when I was about 13, I read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and realized people do the most appalling things to one another, and on a massive scale. And it made me feel, when I read those things as a youngster, that the world of gentleness and Catholic belief, of Sunday Mass and Disneyland that I'd been raised in was somehow a complete illusion. That I would never survive or be able to get ahead in the world as it really was if I lived that way. So there was a kind of dark cloud over my outlook. And the more I learned, the more sobering I found it. I didn't find it consoling or cheerful, but I couldn't stop. I had to get to the bottom. And I think that's also one reason, ultimately, why I wasn't sufficiently relaxed to live a more normal social life, and why I ended up, I didn't find a partner, I didn't have children. But I've now got more friends and more women friends than ever before in my life, and I enjoy life in all the natural and relatively simple ways. And I would be the first to say that although the things I've done have brought me now considerable satisfaction, that there are lots of things it would be good to be able to do or contribute, which I don't have the time or energy to do. I have to leave some things to others. But I can understand the motivations and aspirations of a lot of people with a reasonably broad perspective on things. We perhaps should leave it there for now, because I thought we would go for an hour, and I promised a woman in Perth that I would call her as soon as we were through. So it's nearly 10, which means it's still only 7 p.m. for her, but I better call her or she'll feel I'm standing around.
Yes. Can I just ask you the last 3 questions?
Sure. Oh, 3 questions. Okay.
But they're quick. Do you have any practices that keep you grounded? Like meditation or walking or exercise or cooking or something?
I certainly walk every day, and I cook for myself most of the time. But I don't do either of those things in a ritualistic way that I would call practices that ground me. They're just the way I live. I listen to a lot of music. And one of my practices, you might say, is that every other day I have a long bath, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the evening, and I'll put on a great piece of music, sometimes an opera, sometimes a symphony, sometimes a CD of folk song, and sometimes the folk song might be stuff that takes me back to my childhood. It might be the Seekers, it might be Mary Hopkin, it might be the Beatles, And I just immerse myself in bathing, relaxing, breathing, and listening to music. And I would say the most prominent and therapeutic thing I've done in terms of being grounded, but only in the last 3 years, is writing poetry. I've written poetry prior to that, but it's only become that kind of therapeutic experience in recent years.
The next one is that which book has had the biggest impact on your life? Is it Lord of the Rings?
Oh, it's difficult to say, but I think if I had to nominate a book which, by virtue of the enduring influence it had on my life and the foundational influence it's had on my life, I would have to nominate The Lord of the Rings, which is not to say that it governs my life. I mean, there are many more serious books that I've read since that have informed my view of the world, but it was very early. It was very stimulating, and it stayed with me, and I've read it to nephews and nieces when they were little, and I shared it with Klaus, so yeah, it's pretty central.
And last question, what 3 words describe the best version of you? The person you want to turn up as every day?
An address that Rachel uses, my lovely poet.
Okay. Thanks so much, Paul. We didn't get to talk about liberalism either. I mean, there's so many more topics.
We can do this again. I really enjoyed the conversation. And I would have been happy to keep going, except I said to Kazumi that I would call her at what I thought would be 9:00.
Yes. Send my apologies to your friend in Perth.
That's all right. And it's been great chatting.